Welcome back to our growing experiment. We're here with Dave from Dalew Farms. Dave, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your farm?
Sure. So my name is Dave Lewington. My wife and I own Dalew Farms, and we've been at this for about 18 years here now. We're located in Living, and we primarily raise and sell grass-fed beef. And Chantal, my wife, also operates and owns the online farmers market ClickFork.
Okay, cool. How long you guys been doing that ClickFork?
We've been doing ClickFork for, I want to say, about 5 years. That's kind of been Chantal's baby, that part of it. That started out with as a joint effort between ourselves and 3 other farms when Eat Local Sudbury unfortunately closed down. And initially it was, like I said, a bit of a joint effort. And we ended up kind of taking that over. I think the administration was becoming a bit much for some of the other farmers involved. And Chantal has done the lion's share of the work on growing that ever since and making it what it is today.
For people who don't know what ClickFork is, can you explain a little bit about what it is and how you access it, that type of thing?
Sure. So like we say, it's an online farmers market, and I think Chantal has over 30 vendors on there now. We talk about stuff all the time, but like I say, that's her department. And consumers can go online and shop just like they would at a farmer's market, buy as little or as much as they want. They can see what's available, see the prices. And because there is such a wide variety of produce from so many different local farmers, it allows that same sort of abundance and diversity that you get at the farmers market. But if you're busy, you don't have to leave your home, and we pack the orders together. So if you order things like frozen meats and fresh produce or preserves, the variety all comes ready for you to pick up, and folks meet us at a drop-off point in either Sudbury or North Bay, or locally here in West Nipissing on a set day every other week, and pick up their order. So it's quick, it's easy, and it's ready to go for them, and they get a real flavor of local diversity when they look at all the different items we have available on there.
Yeah, that's a really neat idea to have that availability, because that is sort of one of the hurdles I've seen in a way for having people to shop more locally, is that I think we're sort of spoiled with this going to the supermarket kind of thing where you can have one of everything, right?
Yeah, and the online side, or the online farmers market side of things, as a farmer, we really like it because everything we take those evenings is pre-ordered, and Chantal's actually at the delivery in North Bay tonight. So I know when she comes home that the trailer is going to be empty, as opposed to with a conventional farmers market, which is great for a lot of farmers and a lot of consumers. But sometimes if you get bad weather, you can bring half or whatever of your produce home, and you don't know how much to bring for sure. And the more experienced you get, the better the farmer is at predicting that, and so on. But for us, we really like it because everything that leaves the farm is sold already. And it just helps us to keep things a little fresher and a little better planned for. And we feel for our situation, like we're able to give the customers a little better service because of that aspect.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense, because I think one of the hurdles would be too, is especially when you're operating a farm by yourself, it's really labor intensive, it's really time intensive. So it's not going to be easy to be going there and hauling a bunch of stuff 2 ways, on top of the fact that you're kind of wasting money doing that too.
Yeah, exactly. Because when we've had pigs, and you bring fresh produce home, and we used to grow vegetables and feed it to your pigs, and the pigs are happy, but it's kind of depressing for us, right? If we had a bad Saturday market. Mm-hmm. So that part, just from an emotional standpoint, it's good too, but it's also efficient. And I think it's good for the other farmers that supply ClickFork as well, because they know early Monday morning, Chantal sends them their pick list of what they have and have sold over the previous week of the online sales. and they bring it to us, we pack it, put it together, and then it's kind of out of sight, out of mind until the next week sort of thing. So
Yeah. And when you were talking about how you're doing the packaging and stuff like that, do you guys have like a center, that hub that you guys work at? Like, say all the farms will deliver their produce to you and then you package it up along with the meat as you're going, or?
yes, that's pretty much how it works. So we have converted decommissioned herb transport trailers. So they're a nice clean building that we've been able to use and set up as our packing warehouse, so to speak. And Chantal and her dad, and with a little help from me, we've done a little bit of renovations and tinkering inside, and we now have a licensed kitchen inside one of them to be able to process extra produce and have things available in the off season. And then the second one, there's like a twin right beside it. That's kind of our packing in our warehouse area. So on Mondays and Tuesdays of delivery weeks, they're busy and they're packing all the orders together. So that makes it a little easier for the farmers that supply us, that they don't have to necessarily pack everything with the individual customer's name on it. So it makes it a little faster for them. If you're selling carrots by the bundle, for example, Chantal will just send the order to Field Good Farms, one of our suppliers, and say, we sold 25 bunches of carrots this week, and they bring us 25, and then we take care of getting those packaged to the right customer. So we've actually hired help now. You mentioned the labor intensive side of things earlier, and with ClickFork, we actually have a full-time hired staff person there as well, helping Chantal out, and then a part-time person who would be, I guess, a combination of working for us at Dalew Farms and ClickFork. And then we just started with another hired person this year to help me on the farm, because you know how things go when you hire people. We're thinking the first hire would be partially farm work and partially ClickFork, and ClickFork was taking off so much that it was almost all ClickFork work, and we have to balance those things out as we go. So this spring, the guy we hired is helping me mostly on the farm and doing a little bit of extra help for ClickFork. So we try to balance things between the two businesses and make it all work out as good as we can.
All right. And so you mentioned that you have some help on the farm there now. So what does a typical day sort of look like for you on the farm?
Oh boy. I'm not sure if there is such a thing or not. The weather changes things. Yesterday we had a calf that didn't go where we wanted when we moved the cows from one pasture to another through a bush trail. So that changed the look of our day a little bit. And we were out moving things around to try and get that calf back into the evening. If there is such a thing, we say on a delivery week for ClickFork, Chantal is up at 5 o'clock on Monday morning putting stuff together for all those farmer orders. So she's out there early doing that, and then we'll have breakfast with the kids and get off to chores and things like that. And this time of year we're haying, so I'm off to the field, and Jerry, the guy who's recently started working for us, is busy moving fence to either move the cows or have that ready, because we do daily moves for the cattle with our rotational grazing. So there's lots of work involved in planning that or fixing little things that go wrong. And then we're trying to fit the busyness of haying season in on the sunny days right now. So we're on the tractor a lot, getting hay cut and raked and baled and ready for our winter feed. So
what products of yours do you have on ClickFork?
So with Dalew Farms, we have our grass-fed beef on there, and we've also recently, a little bit unexpectedly, but we've started back with the pastured pork as well. So we had purchased a herd, and then we're just had some pigs start farrowing again this spring, or giving birth. So we're trying to get caught up and back into the swing of that. We had pigs quite a few years ago, so I don't really have to learn anything again. I just have to get our setup going and the breedings and everything kind of going the way we were used to give us a steady supply of pork. So that's the two main things on there. And then my son has a small goat herd as well for meat goats. And our daughter has eggs. So we have pastured hens as well. And that's her little business that you see. Emma's hens or Emma's eggs are available on ClickFork as well through Dalew Farms. So
you mentioned doing the rotational grazing, and I was wondering, you must have access to a lot of land to be able to do that because you're moving them every day, right? And I imagine like a cow eats quite a bit. Like how many cow are you moving in a day, let's say?
Well, this time of year it's changing because we have our babies being born, but we have here we have over 120 head around right now. So the cattle herd has grown a lot versus where we started. We have close to 50 cows that will be calving out babies. And then we have a group of around 70 head at the moment of stocker cattle. So those are our finishing cattle. And those are like, think of those as yearlings per se. And we raise them up to slaughter weight. They would be 18 to 24 months old. And those are the cattle that we're the most particular about making sure they get moved to the best quality forage we can move them to pretty much every day. And that allows the best land improvement, the best like carbon capture to get us our best soil quality. And in turn, better grass makes better beef. And I think that's where right now we're focused a lot on making sure we get those moves done as close to perfect as we can, and planning to make sure that when that inevitable summer drought comes, we've still got forage ahead of us, because the better job we do on our grazing, the longer we can make that stored feed, to not use that stored feed, the better off we are, because stored feed, if we're using fuel and baler twine and plastic and all that stuff, it's more expensive, and it's I suppose it's harder on the environment too. So we want to graze for as long of a season as we can and as productive as we can. And then to get back to answering your question, we do have quite a bit of land that we rent to produce hay on and to graze on. So our stocker cattle herds stay on the home farm every year, and our cows and calves go to some rental farms. And on those farms, we're still improving the pasture, like the components and the grasses and so on. They're getting better all the time, but they're not quite as good a quality forages as what we have here on the home farm. Mm-hmm. So the cows, if we feed them too well, they can almost get too fat to be good at raising their babies. So it kind of works out well that the cows can be the cleanup crew on those farms that need some improving, and the stocker or finisher cattle graze on our best pastures here at the home farm.
Okay, so you mentioned too that you're sort of developing the land and developing the sort of the pasture. So do you get like sort of different plant growth over time after you've run the cows through so many times and you're finishing cows?
Yeah, so I would say here on the home farm, my very best pastures are fields that were hay fields when I moved here, and that I've never ever plowed them up to quote unquote improve them. We found that the best way, when you get that long-term sod or soil structure that comes with that, that really improves the grass growth by grazing and leaving enough residue behind that we cover the soil surface and feed the soil. Whether ideally that's from the cattle trampling that leftover plant growth into the soil just a little bit, and then that acts just like a mulch, the same as if you throw cedar mulch or straw mulch into a garden, right? It protects the soil, it conserves the moisture, and then 30 to 40 or 50 days later, that grass growth is so much better than compared to a field that, say, where we had our gardens and the first year we seeded that back into hay. if the cattle graze that, the soil structure isn't the same, and say it rains, the hoof marks after a rain sink in a lot more to the soil and do a lot more damage. So that's improved soil structure from the long-term no-till really makes for better grass growth, and I think for better cattle care too, because if we do get those rainy days, they're just not sinking into the mud as much, and it's better for the cattle too.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine you'd have to worry about even like injuries, right? If the field gets really muddy, a cow could slip or like break a leg or something like that, I imagine.
Yeah, I should knock on wood, I guess, and just make sure that I don't jinx myself, but that is something like that is pretty rare. The cattle usually, I guess they're like people, they horse around a little bit here and there, but generally the main concern when we have heavy rains is for the soil structure. Like with our grazing system, if we get a really wet stretch or really heavy rains, I'm moving the cattle faster and getting them out of a paddock maybe just a few hours, but sooner than we would otherwise, so they don't beat it up quite as much. And that way it recuperates faster the next 30-40 days into the cycle when they graze it again.
Okay. And do you do like say soil tests to see how much say the structure has changed by looking at it that way, or you just know based on the quality of grazing you get?
For that purposes, it's like a visual assessment that I would see. And back to that example, after a rainstorm, if we put the cattle into say a cover crop field we're grazing that had been recently tilled before we started or something, and it rains and they go into there, you're just seeing deep marks in the mud, and not much left when they leave. Whereas the long-term hay fields or pasture fields, after a heavy rain, it's just not nearly as beat up. The hoof prints are much more shallow, and the field will recuperate faster. We have done a bit of soil testing just to compare, and I would say that the biggest improvements I've seen on that have been where we've applied our manure from our winter feeding onto, or where we've done bale grazing over the winter to build up the soils.
Okay. And so the way that you seem to be trying to do things, and I mean, obviously this makes sense, and I think most farmers do this, is you're trying to take advantage of the resources and sort of manage them in a way, because you mentioned like moving them on the grazing and then trying not to use your stored up hay. I've been hearing recently, like people say like it takes a lot of water to raise cows or something like that. Is that the case, or do you have to like bring water to them all the time? Are they particularly, I guess, resource demanding?
I don't think so. It takes water for cattle. The hotter it is, the more they're going to drink, just like people. We're the same way that way. And we used to have over 12 acres of vegetables here, and I know that took a ton of water when it was hot and dry as well too. To be honest, I've never tried to measure and compare that. We've focused on beef for family reasons and community reasons, because we felt like it was a good fit for us, and because vegetables were something that some of the other younger farmers in the area can get into with maybe a little less land or capital, and we were lucky enough to be able to have some of the equipment we needed to scale up on the cattle and to be able to rent other farms and fence them and so on. So it seemed like it was a good fit for us that way. So that's kind of why we focused on it, and the demand for the beef. I would say as far as the environmental side, we've really focused on producing grass-fed beef because of that. We weren't one of the people that just said, oh, grass-fed beef sounds hot. It sounds like a lot of people are interested in it. Let's go start raising that because people will buy it. We started doing that because we felt strongly that was a good system for the environment and for the health of the consumer. And because at the time there really wasn't anybody doing it and marketing it much locally, we had lots of requests for it. So we just took orders for the first few when we started and bought them based on that. And then it's grown ever since.
Yeah, and another criticism I've heard with, say, farming cattle is that it's a land use thing. But as I understand it too, also you're using a lot of land that you couldn't grow, say, a lot of vegetable or crop on, right? So it utilizes land that otherwise wouldn't be utilized. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I think, like, as far as truth to cattle can utilize land that wouldn't otherwise be utilized, I think that really hit the nail on the head. There's always competing land uses, but a lot of especially where we have our cows and our calves, those are fields that are not tile drained and are fields that were being, depending on how you look at it, neglected. And the landowners are happy that we're there and we're cleaning it up. And when you have grass that grows, it gets grazed off, and then the roots kick back into action and harvest the sunlight and put more carbon back into the soil by having the cattle cycle across that 2 or 3 times a year, that it keeps down, say, the fire risk a little bit in some areas around people's buildings. When we had fires a few years ago, when it was hot and dry, by grazing at the right time and the right intensity, you can reduce that risk, and you can really kind of produce food off of areas that wouldn't have good enough soil to produce vegetables on. And it kind of, to me, I think everything has its place, but I think that's where livestock fit in quite well, is by working in areas that sometimes are not prime land for vegetables, or in areas where the soil would be an erosion risk, for example, because when we're keeping living roots in the soil all year long with perennial pastures, there's if those are managed right, there's no better system that I know of to prevent soil erosion, whether it's through wind or through heavy rains. Because even when we look at our pastures around here after a heavy rain, if there's a forest area where the water's running out of, there's actually more soil in that surface water than there is coming off of our pastures. When I look at the cleanliness of the water, I guess you would say, coming out of those two situations. And I know when we grew lots of vegetables, we, like, no-till is becoming better and better known, but for vegetables, there's certain ones that are really hard to no-till. So you can make arguments on the soil structure side that animals, again, when managed appropriately, can be much better for the environment than certain types of monocrops, right?
Yeah, like, and the way you're describing it, it sounds like regenerative farm practices, which I think is what you say, like, you're using. It's basically, it's building up a higher ecology in the soil. Like, there's more living things in the soil, and you're building better soil quality, and you're also sequestering carbon because you're creating complex plant structure. So it's like, if you do things that way, you're also going to hold more water in the land as well, because you got more roots, more vegetation, more like mulch, like how you say, if the paddock gets knocked down. Because I noticed too, I have one garden in particular I built on like a slanted hill, and I haven't put my mulch on there yet. And that's exactly what you see happens when you pour water on there. It wants to run down. And places where you put a little bit of mulch, it just sits there and it really soaks into the area so the plant can utilize it. So doing like you mentioned, taking care of the animals appropriately in this sort of system might actually be sort of carbon neutral, if not carbon sequestering.
Yeah, and you can read from different grazing proponents that will say exactly that properly done grazing will sequester more carbon than it releases. And again, whether we're looking at vegetable production or animal production, we can that the how it's done really matters, because if we look at factory farms, whether on animals that supply the majority of supermarket meat, most people want that to be out of sight and out of mind, and they don't necessarily want to get to know those producers. So that's why you see from a political side, they kind of put these real mass traceability systems into place to, again, just in my opinion, to give the illusion of traceability and accountability to consumers, so that it's sort of out of sight, out of mind about the animal welfare, the soil improvement or degradation. And then you have your smaller local farms where customers can come out and visit, or they see what they're doing on Facebook when they're moving their cows every day or cleaning up their pastures or whatever it is. And then the same thing applies to vegetables. You can have some small local farms that provide CSA baskets and talk to their customers every week at the deliveries about their no-till or their mulch practices or whatever they're doing in particular to protect the soil. And then the opposite side of that equation is the grocery store, when you've got California lettuce, to pick on one item that's got a recall because of E. coli or whatever it is. So again, the scale and how things are produced matters, whether you're looking at meat or vegetables.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing more people kind of combining the two, where if they have a garden, we'll get some livestock and just kind of make the system kind of work together.
Yeah, and that makes the most sense to me. Like we do a little bit of I wouldn't say cash cropping here, but we're growing what would typically be cash crops to grow feed for our pigs. And prior to us kind of purchasing back the pig herd, we were producing feed for the farmer who was raising pork for Click Fork. So we would just sell him the feed and he'd bring us pork back, kind of thing.
Mhm.
And so that's when you can utilize the manure, and it's an advantage, and it's something that we need and we could use more of, as opposed to when you look at some of the areas of the states where you have giant hog barns that have too much manure for the land that they're on, because they're bringing all the feed in from the US Midwest, and then they concentrate the manure in one area of the country, and they have to bring more and more synthetic fertilizer to the other area of the country just to keep the crop production up. So with our scale, we try to balance those things out.
And that actually jogged something in my memory, because I've been hearing lots about fertilizer recently. Like I've been seeing, I don't know if you've heard about the Dutch farmers over in the Netherlands, and they're basically, I don't know if you want to call it a revolt, but they're definitely very unhappy with their government. And it sounds to me like they're trying to limit the amount of nitrogen they're allowed to have access to, which is a crucial component in fertilizer. And it doesn't make any sense to me why you would want to affect your ability to produce food like that.
Yeah, and that's really complicated. And I was talking with a friend about that the other day too, because when we're busy, we're at our busiest time of year right now. I haven't had quite as much time to kind of dig into and to dig into the weeds, I guess, of that issue. But my initial thoughts are that what's being left out of that conversation is that the government there, much like here, has spent a lot of years politically and subsidizing economically farmers to produce and export more. They're kind of looking at that moron farming system where it's just put more on, put more out, right? And that they've been successful at that because they've been subsidized at that, and the government is leaving out of it their own influence on causing the environmental issues from too much fertilizer, because they've been subsidizing the production, whether it was needed or not in some cases. Where, and actually in this area too, most of our Canadian subsidy programs actually discourage farms like ours from being developed, or from just from seeing us prosper, because when we're diversified, we're unlikely to meet the limits of that will what's the right word there, that will create or cause a payout on the programs. Because if one thing goes down, another goes up, it kind of balances out for us. But if you have a really large specialized farm that focuses on just corn, for example, and then corn has a bad year, then they get a good payout from those programs. And when I assume that that's what's happened with those Dutch farmers, they've been incentivized by the government to produce. And now when all of a sudden people have become more aware of the environmental repercussions of that, now they're saying, oh, you darn farmers, stop producing, or we're taking nitrogen away because that's causing the problem. And they just spent years incentivizing them to use more of it. So it's hard to blame farmers fully when they're upset when someone who's been urging them to do this for so long is suddenly telling them not to do it anymore and taking away what has led to their livelihood for the last while. And it will affect food production for sure, because whether you like high amounts of fertilizer or not, that's what farmers have led to do. And when you kind of forcefully take that away, you're going to cause more damage than if you just remove those subsidies and kind of allow nature to take its course a little bit.
Like the farms would sort of naturally shrink a little bit because they're not going to be put in a situation where they have to grow so much food.
Yeah, like and if you're subsidizing farmers by saying the price of commodity X will never drop below a certain point, then if you get a few more bushels out of a field, then it makes more dollars for them. But if the farmer sits there and says, oh, what if the prices drop and I spend all this money on fertilizer, then I'm going to end up more in the hole. Maybe I should be a little more cautious and keep my input costs low and focus on that instead, because I'm not sure what's going to happen. That's sort of like more of a natural economic consequence. But when we interfere with that, and when we have taxpayer dollars subsidizing, like whether it's corporate welfare in farming or corporate welfare in other businesses, we tend to skew things away from what local people want. And there's all kinds of examples of things that local farmers can't do, either economically or because of different rules that they would otherwise. And I think what's happening in the Netherlands is kind of a really large example of that right now.
When governments subsidize these farmers, they sort of put them in a position where they're more likely to monocrop and less likely to diversify. A diversified crop would be a sort of natural insurance to sort of buttress against what happens in the market too.
Yeah, and I think that causes I guess you would maybe say an unintentional disconnect, if you're being kind, between consumers and farmers. And it's caused by, I guess, the way politicians and bureaucrats are designing these programs. They're designing them to increase exports, to kind of artificially inflate GDP numbers and things like that. But it's not necessarily good for our local communities, whether you're looking at the environment or the economy. And we're kind of seeing the results of that right now. And after we've had a couple years of farmers and citizens all over being told what to do in every part of their lives and getting tired of that, I think farmers and other groups of people are going to be a little quicker to show their frustrations when these changes come about and are forced onto them by governments.
Well, and that's sort of an interesting point you made about artificially inflating the GDP, because I've been thinking about this a lot and I haven't been able to figure it out. I'm like, why wouldn't you want to, especially in a place like Canada where we have so much land, why wouldn't you want to like farm the crap out of this? And like, why wouldn't every bit of food on a Canadian's plate, why wouldn't it be grown in Canada? like, especially if you had way more farmers and you have way more diverse crops and stuff like that, you can provide a high quality of food, more locally sourced for a lot of people. And I tend to believe that smaller farms potentially are going to be more environmentally conscious because of their scale, they're more attached to the land, maybe. And if they're not having these sort of subsidies that they can rely on, they have to have these natural insurances. And that's the thing I find too in talking to a lot of these farmers, is that it's community building when you know exactly where your food comes from and you can go and see the farm. And it's like, it just seems like we're going totally the opposite way, where we're becoming sort of atomized and basically nobody in a sort of world, when rather we could be somebody in a small community that's sort of participating in a local economy.
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to the question you've been thinking about. But it seems to me from the thought I've put into that, that whether that was the intention or not, the result we're getting from these programs where and when I say we, like the royal we, where governments are spending money with supposed good intentions, I think we're causing a lot of inflation, which causes panic in people, and scared and panicked people don't always make rational decisions. And the farther we get from allowing two individuals to decide how their food is grown between them, by imposing rules and regulations and subsidies to incentivize the production of one crop or another, then we're messing up those signals. Like if I'm the farmer and you're my customer and you say, I want grass-fed beef, then I can do that. If you say, I want grain-fed beef, I think, Dave, you're full of baloney. Grass-fed beef isn't any better. Well, I've got a decision to make. Do I want to keep you as a customer? Or do I want to hope that there's another customer out there that believes differently than you? But if the government comes along and says, we think grass-fed beef is the greatest thing since sliced bread, we're going to pay every producer so many dollars a pound to produce that, all of a sudden you're going to have farmer after farmer producing grass-fed beef, not because they believe it's the better environmental way to go or more nutritious beef. They're going to do it because they've been incentivized by the government to do it. And then you're going to start to see environmental degradation because some farms will overgraze their pastures just to have more supposed grass-fed beef to hit the government-led incentives. And I think in a roundabout way, that's a lot of what has happened with the crop farming and with the fertilizer usage and increased rates and problems environmentally, because it is a real tricky situation getting back to the farmer protests in Holland, because we consider ourselves to be environmentally minded, ecological minded farmers. So we want to see really low rates of anything used whenever possible. But I also see it from their point of view when they've been kind of led down this path for so long, and all of a sudden the government's trying to yank it away from them and make the farmers look like the bad guys, when it's the government policies that have essentially caused the situation they're in at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think about if something like that were to happen here, where, I mean, as I understand it, our government subsidizes a lot of the food that we grow here as well. And I would have to think that, like, if our government, in the same sort of effort to cut down on emissions and basically reduce sort of farming, I mean, they'd sort of do the same thing. They'd put the stress on the farmers here in the same way.
Yeah, and to me, I just don't see how it can make sense. And again, because we consider ourselves ecological farmers, probably a lot of even maybe many of our customers would think, oh, Dave must be in favor of 1 million environmental regulations to practically put those other farmers out of business. And that's not the case, because we always have these unforeseen consequences when we start interfering with those things. And if we put those farmers out of business, something else will take its place. And it won't necessarily be good unless we allow the time for people to make those changes naturally and stop. We need to kind of stop incentivizing what we consider to be the bad outcomes by interfering with that. If we just allow like eaters and producers to work together with the least amount of interference, I think we're going to get the most nutritious and the best price food out of that in the long run.
Yeah, I think we really have to focus on making well, it's not really up to us, but I think the idea would be if the changes would be small, then we'd be able to manage it better, right? Where we wouldn't have people perhaps not having the food.
Yeah, and again, I think it kind of goes back to individual freedom, because one farmer or one consumer might be at a point in their life when they're able to make a big and a drastic change for the better. And there might be another farmer or another consumer who, if you force those changes on them too fast, you'll have catastrophic consequences to their health or to the farmer's business. And when we try to fit everybody into these one size fits all solutions, we end up causing, like, we cause harm whether we mean to or not.
Yeah, it's the unintended consequences of having a really centrally managed economy. I mean, I mean, generally, I don't think as Canadians we think, maybe I'm wrong about this, but generally, I don't think most Canadians think of us as having a sort of socialist government. But when you look at the amount of regulation that, say, goes in just with our farming, I mean, it basically is a centrally managed economy. And the problem is even if you do have the best of intentions, you're going to create these inevitable sort of loops that'll have catastrophic ends to the people that are basically in these loops you've created.
Yeah, and over the last 2 years, that has gotten far worse from my personal opinion. And what I worry about is that all of the freedoms that were taken away from people in so many aspects of their lives over the last 2 years, that mindset is going to be transferred into every aspect of the food system. And if we want the freedom to be able to produce food in a way that's different than normal, like grass-fed beef, for example, but there's a government bureaucrat that hasn't read the research on the nutritiousness of grass-fed beef or the carbon sequestration or whatever it is that you want to look at, and they suddenly decide that we can produce more beef in Canada if everybody raises their cattle in feedlots and feeds them corn. We can produce the bigger cattle, make them fatter, make them faster, or make them fatter faster rather, and sell more beef and produce more food for the world. There will be people out there that only look at that and think that's the way to go. And if we don't preserve kind of that food freedom for people to be able to make their own choice for their own situation, I think in the long run, we're just starting a race to the bottom. We need to allow research and innovation and development, because if we kind of listen to the health experts of years ago, we wouldn't be using butter now. Everybody would be on margarine. And it was the outliers at the time who looked at different research or done different research and realized that, well, butter isn't as bad as what some people thought at that time. Or eggs are another example, which I think a lot of health experts at one point were urging people to stay away from eggs or to avoid the egg yolks. And there's been, I think, a different line of research, and people have come around to realize that that wasn't necessarily the case either. So if we don't allow people kind of that freedom to choose, we kind of box ourselves into making everybody the same, and we don't progress in the long run that way.
It reminds me of this quote, I think it was from René Girard. He talked about, like, you know, the world seems to be getting more and more alike all the time. And people think that's a good thing because we'll all get along. But he said it's the equivalent of having us all go up with a single match. It's like, it reminds me of bananas. So, you know, those like candy bananas you get, they're flavored a certain way. They don't taste like a banana you buy at the store. What I understand is basically those bananas are flavored off of an older style of banana that was mass farmed. It was called a Cavendish. And basically at some point there was some kind of either virus or disease that affected one crop of plants, and it spread because I guess the way that they get these seedless bananas is you would have to essentially graft it onto some kind of rootstock and plant your sort of, I don't know if you call it an orchard or your banana patch, let's call it that. So anyways, everything was all exactly the same. And all it took was one virus to come through and you have no more bananas of that kind anymore. And, you know, when you have a system where it's trying to make everyone the same, you're getting rid of all of that potential innovation by having those dissenters there, right? Because somebody who was, say, growing something other than the Cavendish, you know, which is what we're growing now. So likely there's someone was doing that, even though people all thought, oh, the Cavendish was the best one. That's the money crop. That's the sweetest banana. Well, the dissenter who was doing the different banana, well, he's in business now and those other guys aren't.
Yeah, and I think allowing dissent is important, whether that's with our food or our thought process, because when you mention the idea about, I guess, and I'm paraphrasing, but tolerating people that think differently than we do or produce food differently than we do, if we don't tolerate that, if we try to make everyone the same, it seems like it breeds an even higher level of intolerance for the few that are left and are different. And whether that's looking at plants or livestock production or people in general, I think that generally applies. And I think we need to kind of pump the brakes on that a little bit and allow for diversity of thought and opinion and growing practices, and be a little less quick to condemn others and just try to focus on what works for the individual in that regard. And I think if we didn't have all these outside factors kind of causing undue influences, I think that we would have a food system that those of us in the local food movement really want to see. We'd be a lot closer to that than what we are now without all of these outside influences. And it's taken me a long time to get my mind around to thinking that way, because when I was younger, I would look at whether it was an environmental issue or a food safety issue, and I would simply think, we need to ban factory farms, or we need to ban this pesticide, or we need to ban, I think GMOs are maybe one of the best examples I can give you, because we're not a fan of them. And that's kind of where one of the things we draw the line on, that we won't use on the farm, and our click fork producers don't use either. And when we do have a couple of issues, like there's some dairy products that are really hard to get because of all the rules that would fit into our click fork thing. So we kind of put a little proviso on there and say dairy products are hard to get, so these ones may have GMOs, and basically everything else on click fork doesn't have GMOs in it. So if I've worked with the farmers union to try and lobby to not allow approval for GMO crops at times in the past, but when I think about it now, I think we should have just had no regulation on GMO crops. And that would have scared the crap out of me if somebody would have said that 15, 20 years ago. But I think what that would have done is that would have made the producers, whether that's the Monsanto who was producing the crop or the farmer who planted it, they would have thought twice. Because if you plant a crop that's fundamentally different and it cross-pollinates with the neighbor's organic canola, your stuff crosses the border into the neighbors and pollutes their crop, you're going to be liable for that. Just like farmers, when they spray with herbicides, if the wind pushes it across, they're liable. That's well understood. So because we went through this regulatory process for GMO crops, which, depending on your point of view, some people think was a bit of a sham, but it is approved. So that protects Monsanto, and it protects the farmer who grows it and pollutes his neighbor's crop of canola. And it pretty well killed the organic canola industry because it was spread so easily. So if we could have a magic eraser and back up and just say, you know what, we're not going to have any kind of regulatory system for that in Canada. But if you pollute your neighbor's canola crop, you're going to be liable and you're going to have to pay. Farmers would have thought twice about it and they would have been more careful, and so would Monsanto have, and we might still have an organic canola industry that would be prospering here. So I think that's a long-winded story, but I think that's how we maybe need to adjust our thinking and tolerate people that are thinking differently than we do, and just come up with systems so that we don't inadvertently affect others, but we can still satisfy what our customers want.
Yeah, and like when you're talking about all that too, it makes me think about like how important, say, our food is to, say, something like freedom, like your sovereignty. Because if you can't decide where your food comes from, well, then you're not really free. I mean, if you couldn't grow, say, your own food, or you can't choose to get it from a local provider, that's not very free, because you're already sort of locked into some kind of system. And also, what I'm hearing out of that too is that, but when you have less regulation, although it's sort of expedient for sort of, say, big business, when you have less regulation, you encourage there to be responsibility with all the people who are participating in the sort of exchange. And so then you're going to get more ethical behavior because the people are ultimately more responsible for their actions. And then you can have more freedom because people act more responsibly. So you can't really have freedom in a society that's always trying to round the corners off, because the less sort of responsibility you need to take, the less responsible you're going to be, and the less sort of ethical you have to be, because you're not engaged with anything you're doing anymore. You sort of have bumper rails on at the bowling alley.
Yeah, and I think freedom and responsibility are super important and go hand in hand, like you said. And I think what maybe a lot of folks don't realize, and that the younger version of myself didn't, is that a lot of these regulations, although they sound good, like who could be against food safety, or who could be against inspectors looking at the meat plants more closely and things like that. But what it does is it often gives, I got to be careful what I say, but I kind of think the illusion of really close oversight. But when you have a really large packing plant that has thousands of cattle going through a week, and you look at the number of carcasses those inspectors look at, and you look at our local abattoir that has 20 a week, what are the risk factors there? But they're minuscule compared to that plant with 1,000 cattle a week. And yet the cost per pound of beef for that local small abattoir to comply with those regulations is just astronomical compared to what it is for the plant that has thousands of cattle going through a week. And I think that we don't realize what some of those big plants do on the lobbying side of things, because although it's perceived that they're against, the big bad guys are against regulations, I think they actually are in favor of them, because they know it keeps competition out. Because for the most part, local producers can't go to the grocery store and get in there with meat products. You have to have federal inspection. And how many federal plants are there? Very, very few. And they won't even look at a little guy like us, even though on the local food front, some people think of Dalew as one of the larger producers. We still wouldn't even get a look at a grocery store. And again, that's because of this sort of regulatory barrier that's been created, and adds to that disconnect between the eater and the farmer. And if we didn't have so many regulations, I think the eater or the consumer is going to think twice when they walk into the grocery store about what they purchase. Whereas now they just assume the government has looked after that, right? We've been trained over the years through school and messaging, I guess, to just assume that they're looking after the food safety. And you're going to have a bad actor in there no matter what, sooner or later. So if you guys come and meet us and you think, Dave, I don't trust you, I'm not going to buy from you, you're protecting yourself. But if the government supposedly done that and I'm that bad actor, you don't know that, right? You don't get to make that call. So I think we're giving people the illusion of food safety, and then we're also causing farmers to kind of produce for absences as opposed to just trying to produce the most nutritious food we can, right? I think that's another unintended consequence of the system that's been created over the last number of years.
Yeah, I mean, you always got to try to give people the benefit of the doubt, but it would seem to me like if you're a huge business that's like managing huge scale farms, you can deal with the cost of, say, a fine, or you can deal with the cost to sort of lobby some government person to put in some new kind of regulation to use a certain kind of fertilizer or use a certain kind of crop or whatever, because you can make an argument to the government, say, hey, well, this product we grow, we have a 30% more efficiency and blah, 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 blah. So you really need to use our product because it'll save the environment, because it'll do this, because it'll do that. And they've got all the money in the world to promise this kind of stuff. And by the time it gets out into the real market, say to us, they've already spent their money and it's kind of in the past. I mean, it's done deal. So, I mean, you have poor incentives there, right? And then also, it troubles me too that you'll have a lot of politicians who run on this idea of supporting the working person or whatever. And then you have these clear obstacles that are put in the way of smaller scale entrepreneurs who want to go out and make a living with hard work and dignity. And they're sort of denied that because they don't have the big paychecks that it takes to deal with the regulatory business.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that, but I think it kind of all comes back to the same theme. Like, we need to kind of grant a certain amount of respect and fairness to people that want to produce food or in a certain way, or make their lifestyle choices in a certain way, and kind of even accept their own risks. And if we try to mandate those things all the time, we always prejudice against one group of people or one group of businesses. And we find out 50 years later that was a bad idea. We can't seem to, as a society, to learn to stop prejudicing ourselves in our current time, but we can apologize for what happened 50 years ago. And I think what we're seeing with some of the farmer protests right now, we need to be careful of that we don't just kind of mandate everything and box everything into the same area, so that we don't have those recurring problems again. And because we're so immersed in the food system, we see that happening, and I think we have a hard time putting into words like exactly the best way to fight back against that. And then people are always so worried about speaking out too, because if the conversation you and I are having, there's going to be people that won't like it and say, how can those guys speak poorly of government bureaucrats that are just trying to protect the population? And I think we have to kind of look at the reality of the situation as opposed to the intended consequences, and just keep reverting back to respecting that freedom of choice as much as possible, so that we don't make mistakes. Because if we mandate mistakes, those people were harmed through poor quality food or whatever it is, without that being their own choice. And stuff like that really bothers me a lot, I think.
Well, and it's kind of a thing for me that I learned because I love studying history, is that very often there's some little group of people that's being wronged by basically the mob. There's sort of one common way of thinking that's about the day. They think that this is a certain way, and of course they're right. Because I also think that humans, we have this sort of hubristic tendency to think that because we're here now, we could never make the same foolish mistakes as the people from 100 years ago. And I think that's probably likely why we make them over and over and over again. Like, especially in today's climate, where we hear a lot about, say, historical victims and victim status and stuff like that, we can't we can't look at that and then also be totally blind to the fact that we have a sort of repeat of that going on right now. Like, I mean, it's kind of clear to anybody who's paying attention. I mean, depending on what side of the argument, you might think it's right or it's wrong to sort of treat a different subset of people in a different way. But I mean, history shows that usually that person's wrong who says, oh, I'm right, you're wrong, you should do what I say. It's usually just kind of leave people to their own things, and it's just better that way.
Yeah, and I put a lot of thought into this because my hobby over the last while has become following politics and working on that stuff. And I agree with you. I think what's happened over the last couple of years has been exactly that. We're running as hard as ever towards kind of a historical repeat of picking on a group of people, and the consequences that some of us have endured over the last couple of years might pale in comparison to some of the really tragic things that have happened in our history. But by the same token, they're probably also the worst consequences of our current time. So I think we need to keep that in mind, and we can't talk about historically recognizing that we were intolerant in the past and apologize for our intolerance of a different culture or a different belief, and then double down in 2022 on intolerance of someone who chose not to get a shot and now they can't go on a vacation or travel or whatever it is. And those sorts of intolerances, if we allow them in our general society or with what's happened with COVID, that's going to come to our food system as well in spades. And that worries me, that a producer like Dalew Farms, we're potentially just one government bureaucrat away from them convincing the big guys that we're kind of this new plague, that somehow grass-fed beef farmers could be a big problem, and folks will become intolerant to that, and we kind of get canceled and not allowed to do what we've done and what we've satisfied customers with over the years. And I think a lot of folks don't necessarily think of it that way, but I think that's the way we need to think about what's happened over the last while.
Yeah, well, I think it's common for people to think of things as sort of existing in their own little separate sort of bubbles or like vacuums in a way. It's like, well, there's this thing going on and there's this thing going on, but they're not related in any way. But if it's changing the fundamental sort of way with which we engage with each other, that affects everything in society, right? So, when we're creating sort of prejudicial behavior, we can't, especially thinking about the history, think that it's not going to say intensify, get worse, or spread, or become sort of a systematic thing of its own kind. I mean, it's pretty clear that is sort of what's going on. I mean, now this is my opinion. I mean, it's obviously always benefited the government to have a sort of bad guy to have, right? Because the government, their motto seems to be, I'm a good guy, I can help you out, I can take care of you, and look at that bad guy over there, I'll keep you away from him. And I mean, it just because like I said, I love history, and when I see like sort of how empires run and how they manage the little provinces in their empires, it's a classic tactic that you pit the population against itself, and it makes it much more easier to sort of manage the population. Because when you're in an intensive sort of state of consciousness, like you're sort of irritated or anxious, you don't think as clearly, and you sort of go along with what everyone else is doing, because we're naturally not a herd animal, but like we're arguably more herd-like than we sort of recognize. We kind of generally like to blend in with the pack and go along. And I mean, that's why we have these old sayings, like, the nail that sticks out gets hammered, or the tall blade of grass gets cut, that kind of thing, right? And I mean, yeah, it certainly seems that we're blindly stepping into the same traps we've stepped in. And that's why I always think that, you know, as history goes on, people don't really seem to change all that much. I mean, we get new clothes, we get worse clothes, empires rise and fall, but the wiring that's kind of in here seems to be the same thing. And we're always looking for a scapegoat, it seems like.
Yeah, I think we progress to a certain extent, and I think the more we provide like kind of those moral freedoms and allow people to voluntarily interact without interference, we actually prosper more and more and more, because like when ecological farmers get together and talk, they talk about ways to improve their farms, improve their production. They're not, when they're left to their own devices, they're not fighting with each other and picking on each other and trying to diminish each other. They're actually working together. And the same thing with our customers. We talk to people, we try to produce what they want. But when we have this outside force trying to interfere and force onto us or to our customers what somebody else's customers may want, that's when, instead of being healthier and more prosperous, we start to decline into that state of intolerance. So I still have, I think, a lot of optimism that if we kind of continue to have these difficult conversations like we've ended up having here tonight, and we encourage people to be tolerant of differences, and we encourage that freedom of choice, then the things that we didn't expect to be really good for us can kind of come to the forefront on their own naturally. And whether that's natural production systems or natural immunity in a certain type of banana, like you mentioned earlier, that natural immunity can be very important, even though for a while we didn't think it was. And that applies to bananas, and that applies to people right now. And I think the more we can convince people that allowing the freedom to see that flourish, the healthier our society and our food systems will be.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because it makes me think that we're sort of having a tendency towards a more natural farming, and what happens to go hand in hand with that is a more natural sort of level of human interaction, which is basically without really any interference. And when people are sort of left alone to sort of engage with each other as they sort of will, maybe we don't give people enough. We actually do engage in more friendly behavior, especially if we're local, because I mean, it's kind of hard to be aggressive to someone who's, you know, is your neighbor, right? I mean, you know, you're going to see that guy in town. So, I mean, a more natural food system and a more natural system of interaction for people. And I mean, that sounds like a wonderful thing to me. And on that positive note, could you let people know where they'd be able to sort of get a hold of your products, or the best way to get contact with that?
Probably clickfork.ca is the best place, because you can get a hold of Dalew Farms products there, and then all the other great farmers that work with us and provide just a whole array of amazing local products. Their products are all listed there too. And that will make Chantal as busy as ever, which is good also. And our employees like to work lots as well too. It keeps everyone busy and happy. And I always tease Chantal and Jose that when I walk by as I'm doing stuff outside and I hear them working in the trailer, I say, is there any work going on in there? There's an awful lot of giggling, but they're having fun while they're working hard. And I think that's what it's all about. And even though I'm doing a lot of the farm work, I often see the producers when they drop their bulk orders off, and it might be just for a couple minutes, where Ryan and I will chat about how something is growing or the weather or whatever. And it's so nice to see people's smiles when they drop off their orders, or when a customer picks something up at the delivery. And it just, I think that's, in a lot of ways, that's what it's all about. We get to see the environmental side, see animals born and crops growing, and then we get to see the customers' experiences as well too. So that's the way that people can not only support us, but support lots of other ecological minded farmers too.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, guys.